The parable of the prodigal son, a story of forgiveness, repentance, and unconditional love. Today, we will delve into one of the most touching and profound stories in the entire Bible, the parable of the prodigal son. This narrative speaks to us of repentance, forgiveness, and the immense love of God who never gives up on welcoming us back no matter how far we may have strayed. The story of the prodigal son teaches us that even when we make mistakes, there is always a chance for a fresh start and reconciliation. Through this parable, Jesus shows us that the Father's love for us is unconditional and that He is always ready to forgive and restore us, no matter the magnitude of our error. Before we begin, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories that can transform your life. Let's explore together the lessons this parable has to teach us. During one of His teaching moments, Jesus shared with His disciples and the crowd a parable that would deeply touch the hearts of all who heard it. The story begins with a simple yet profoundly significant introduction. A certain man had two sons. These two sons represent different attitudes, characteristics, and choices that ultimately reflect humanity and each person's relationship with God. The younger son, the more impulsive of the two, approached his father with a bold request. Something unusual and even shocking to the listeners of that time. He said, "Father, give me the share of the inheritance that belongs to me." In the Jewish culture of that era, an inheritance was only given after the father's death. This request was, therefore, akin to the son saying to his father, "I value what you have to offer me more than your presence. I prefer your wealth over your company." This act was not merely a financial matter, but a rejection of paternal authority and familial love. The son sought to live independently, free from his father's expectations and the home where he had been raised. Surprisingly, the father did not show anger or resistance. Instead, he divided his property between his two sons, giving the younger son his share. This was highly unusual and demonstrated the father's generosity and patience. He did not force his son to stay, allowing him to make his own choices, even though he knew they might lead to harm. By accepting his son's decision, the father granted him the freedom to choose his path, even at the risk of losing him. After receiving his inheritance, the younger son wasted no time leaving his father's house. He gathered all he had, everything his father had given him, and set off for a distant land. He was searching for something beyond what he knew. Perhaps adventure, unrestricted freedom, a life without the rules and discipline of home. He wanted to distance himself from everything his father represented. Once in the distant land, he lived recklessly, squandering all he had on parties, fleeting pleasures, and the company of false friends. But, as with all things built on empty promises, the prodigal son's life soon began to collapse. It wasn't long before his money ran out, and with it, his friends and the revelry disappeared. When his wealth was gone, he was hit hard by the harsh reality of a life without a solid foundation. A severe famine arose in that distant land, worsening the young man's plight. He found himself utterly vulnerable, without resources, friends, or support, and most painfully, without his father's guidance. Desperate and with no other options, the prodigal son sought work and found a job with a local man who sent him to feed pigs. For a Jew, working with pigs was one of the most humiliating and impure occupations, as pigs were considered unclean animals in Jewish tradition. By this point, the son had lost all remnants of his former luxury. He lived in extreme poverty and humiliation, so desperate that he longed to eat the pods the pigs were fed, but no one gave him anything. In this moment of extreme need, the younger son, completely broken and with a heavy heart, came to his senses. He had a profound reflection on his life, choices, and current situation. He remembered his home, his father, and the fact that even his father's hired servants had more than enough to eat. He realized the gravity of his mistake and the harshness of his present reality. He knew he had made a terrible decision in demanding his inheritance and leaving behind the stability and love of his father. With a plan in mind, the prodigal son decided to return home. He knew he was no longer worthy of being called his father's son. He had dishonored his father by asking for his inheritance while the father was still alive and then wasting it irresponsibly. So he resolved to return and ask for forgiveness. He rehearsed what he would say: "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." With these words of repentance and humility, the son began his journey back. He knew the road would be difficult and full of uncertainty. Would he be met with anger? Would his father reject him? He didn't know what to expect, but the pain of separation, hunger, and loneliness drove him to take the chance. He felt he had no other choice. It was his last hope for forgiveness and a new beginning. While he was still a long way off, the father, who constantly watched for his son's return, saw him in the distance. The father's heart, filled with compassion and love, overflowed with joy at the sight of the familiar figure approaching. Without hesitation, he ran to his son. Something unthinkable for a man of his age and position in society. He didn't care what others might think. He didn't wait for the son to reach him. His love for his son was so great that he couldn't stand still. He ran, embraced his son, and kissed him with deep emotion. The son, surprised and moved, began to speak the words he had rehearsed: "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But before he could finish, the father interrupted him. With great joy and unusual generosity, the father ordered his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The father's forgiveness was complete and unconditional. He didn't just welcome his son back. He restored him with honor, treating him like royalty in his house. As the celebration began, the older son was out in the field working. He heard the sound of music and dancing and asked one of the servants what was happening. The servant explained that his younger brother had returned and that their father had welcomed him back with great joy. Hearing this, the older son became furious and refused to join the celebration. He couldn't comprehend how his brother, who had squandered the family's wealth on a reckless lifestyle, could be received with such love and honor. The father, noticing his elder son's anger, went out to speak with him, attempting to calm him down. He said, "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The father pleaded with his older son to join in the joy of the household, to understand the grace being extended to his younger brother. Yet, despite the father's efforts, the older son seemed unwilling to accept the grace and forgiveness being offered. Jesus ends the parable without revealing the older son's final response. This open-ended conclusion invites each of us to reflect on our own attitudes toward God's grace, mercy, and forgiveness. The story of the prodigal son is a remarkable reflection of God's unconditional love for us, carrying lessons that go far beyond what meets the eye. When the younger son decides to return home, he finds not just forgiveness, but also acceptance, restoration, and a celebration. The father doesn't meet him with reproach or criticism, but with compassion, because all he ever wanted was to see his son come back. And so it is with God. No matter how far we may stray, He is always ready to welcome us with open arms and restore us to our rightful place as His beloved children. This parable reminds us that in our failures, we can always find our way back to God. Genuine repentance leads to a new chance, a new beginning, and, most importantly, draws us closer to a Father who loves us more than we can imagine. At times, like the older son, we may struggle to understand this kind of grace, but it is available to all of us without exception. If you were touched by this message of forgiveness, hope, and redemption, leave a like on this video to help us continue sharing stories that transform lives. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content, and turn on notifications to stay updated whenever we publish new videos. Share this message with those you know who also need to hear about God's unconditional love. We are deeply grateful for your presence with us, and we hope that, like the prodigal son, you feel inspired to always return to the loving embrace of the Father. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.